Hello, beautiful divine souls. Welcome back to Goddess Unleashed or Goddess of Rebirth, the podcast, depending on what platform you're in. In this podcast, we uncover the hidden truths of our emotional landscapes. I'm Monica, and in this episode, we're focusing on a poignant and inescapable aspect of life, grief. Joining me today is Kenya Raymer, Earth Walker, who provides guidance through the processes of grief and mourning. Kenya, I'm so honored to have you here with me today. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I am excited and I'm feeling good.
Beautiful. I know that I'm introducing you as a dead walker, and that's kind of like limiting all the beautiful things that you are. Can you tell the audience a little bit who are you? Who is Kenya?
Sure. I think this is probably the hardest part of my work is identifying and giving it a title or a name. But I think that when I think about what I do, I am a guide. First and foremost, I support people in their journeys by in many different manifestations. So sometimes that looks like I'm offering readings, oracle readings, or I'm offering energetic clearings for the bodies, the physical and the energetic bodies. Sometimes that looks like I'm teaching. I'm a teacher. I teach courses on intuitive development. Sometimes that looks like I'm a matriarch holding circles, healing circles for shadow work, for expansion and awareness and connection with spirit. Sometimes that looks like I'm a channel and I'm sharing messages, um, with the collective. Sometimes that looks like I'm a death walker, and even that manifests in a couple different ways. And a death walker is a type of death worker who I would say I walk people home. That's the work that I do. I walk people home, whether it be through micro deaths, which are metaphysical deaths or ego deaths, right? I walk people home back to themselves, back to their highest selves, whether that be in physical death. I walk people to and through meeting physical death, dying into the death process. And also on the spiritual side, I I'm a psychopomp as well. So I walk spirits who are still tethered to the physical plane. I walk them over the bridge. I walk them home as well. So I feel like the work that I do, I'm answering a calling, and that calling I serve as a guide. And so that I show up in a lot of different ways because I'm here in service, not really making a career. So it looks like a lot of different things, but I say it all falls under guide, and it always falls under walking someone home.
Thank you for saying that, because I do feel like women need permission. The permission we need to give ourselves permission to be everything that we are, and we're so into these like labels and boxes, trying to achieve like the perfect mom, the perfect teacher, the perfect channel, and we're all of it, and it's perfect in its beauty and in its imperfection. So thank you for all of that. That was a full introduction. Tell me a little bit about your journey with grief. How is that you felt called into it? How did you react? Like, this is my calling.
Yeah. Um, I feel like my journey with grief, I mean, I can pinpoint the pivotal moment that I feel like the grief brought me into service. And my gosh, I can't even think of the year. I had my first miscarriage in 2011, I want to say 2011. And then I experienced another miscarriage about 2 or 3 years later. And I, it took me about a year to even speak about the first miscarriage. At the time, it was still very taboo to talk about miscarriage and um, the death of unborn babies publicly. And so it took me about a year, and that grief was so heavy and so hard to maneuver and process and carry because I was trapping it inside. And then about a year later, I wrote something about it and shared publicly about it. And it got this really beautiful, wild, organic response of a lot of people needing that kind of those words, needing that story to be kind of out in the open so that they could see it and identify with it and move, you know, allow it to move them on their grief journey as well. And so when I experienced my second miscarriage, I didn't hesitate to share and grieve publicly and out loud and unapologetically. And I shared my whole grieving process through my Instagram page and through my writings. And it was just so cathartic and so healing. And I learned so much about grief and how to move it through the body and how the body experiences it and how important it is that we heal grief and what a large wound grief is for the collective. I mean, I saw that right away in just this one layer of mothers and families experiencing this, one very particular experience. There's just so much grief in that space. And so then we think about all of the other spaces of loss, and the grief is just so vast in the collective. And so my relationship with grief and being in service to grief started then, and it has just evolved. I then went on to have a daughter, and I shared my story of trying to conceive, and then my pregnancy, which had some rough moments, and then postpartum, which was very hard for me the first year, especially, and then the second year postpartum. And I just shared publicly, and I shared out loud, and I grieved with um, my social media family, my soul family that's connecting, on social media. We grieved together, we grieved out loud. And it was just this really wildly healing and cathartic experience. And so I know that as spirit is source is moving me into um, a new phase of death work, because that was death work as well, right? And so now that I move into a new expression of my death work, I know that I will meet grief in new ways. And my work is just to continue showing up and meeting that grief publicly, because we need that. We need to see each other in the wound and in the healing so that we know that it's survivable. I don't know if that's a word, but I'm going to use it today so that we know that the wound is survivable and that the grief is able to be processed and then carried in a sustainable way, that there's something on the other side of this deep grief.
And I love that you bring this sacredness into the work. You know that is so work that is so feared, is so misunderstood. There's so many misconceptions. We don't talk about any of it, and yet when I hear you speaking, I feel this sweetness, there's this tenderness about the work that it makes it so sacred, so beautiful. So tell me about grief. What is grief?
Grief is this intense emotion or feeling that we experience around any type of loss. Um, it is not loyal to any type of loss. We experience grief across the board when we lose a loved one, when we lose a relationship, when we lose a job or work or career, when we lose a city, when we move, we experience it. Um, Anytime life shifts and requires a new version of ourselves, we experience grief. And sometimes that grief goes like unclocked, you know, when it's especially like a new version of self, and we kind of don't realize that we've been in the transition, we've been with moving with death, and things have been hard and messy and complex for a while. And then the birth happens, and sometimes the death blurs into the birth because birth itself is also messy and complex and bewildering. So sometimes we have a trouble separating the two, and it just becomes this one kind of long, arduous experience. And the grief goes unclocked. And so then the grief is this thing, this energy that builds up in our bodies, our physical body, our energetic body, our emotional body, our mental body, our spiritual body, all aspects of ourself, and it seeps into everything, and it twists, and it uh, turns, and it builds up, and it creates blocks, and um, it keeps us from experiencing the world as it is, and from experiencing truth, right? It skews our perspective. um, so it starts out as this emotion, and then it becomes this kind of, in many situations, this lifelong partner that we live with and move with and learn to exist with.
I think there's wisdom in grieving. There's an intelligence in our body that uses that wisdom, that intelligence to regenerate and to restore. But we're disconnected from it. We don't know how to grieve. We don't understand grief in general. We feel like it's the end, and we try to run away from it and to deny it. But in your experience, is there any wisdom? How can we connect with grief in a healthy way,
Yeah.
process it, and
Yeah.
understand it?
There's so much wisdom in grief and in death. Um, I sometimes think of death, and so then you can also think of grief in this way as well, is like a gift basket. And people think that the gift basket is only full of like sadness and pain and heartache. And that is true. Those things are in the basket. But there's other things in the basket too, you know? And in death and in birth, those are the only two times that we can access this clarity of source energy. You will never get that type of clarity outside of death and birth. And in that moment, yes, we are experiencing deep pain and heartache and sadness and anger and resentment and all of these other expressions of energy, right? All these other feelings. But there's also this moment where we know everything that there is to know about our lives. And you can ask people who have experienced death, or mothers right after birth who are also experiencing a death of themselves. So they're experiencing this death in birth in the same moment. And you can ask them, there's this quiet clarity that I don't even know if it's quiet. It's a clarity that's kind of blaring, maybe. And it says, turn off your phone. That's not important. Do this. This is important. It brings forth priorities. It brings forth what's important. It brings forth a clear path for healing. We know exactly what to do, who to make amends with, what to say. We know what relationships are draining us and to end them. And we know what relationships to kindle and to nurture. And we know what paths will serve our highest good and our expansion. We know all of these things in this very brief moment with death and or birth. And everything becomes clear in that moment. And if we listen to that clarity, that knowing, we can serve ourselves so well in healing. Um, and you won't experience that depth of clarity in meditation, through psychedelic drugs, through ayahuasca, through any retreat, hiking any ancient ruin. You won't. You'll experience great clarity and beauty in all of those things, I'm sure. But the clarity that comes with the deep connection that comes with comes with death and birth, that deep connection with source, that deep clarity, it only comes in that handbasket. And so there's definitely wisdom to be had, because we need to anchor everything that we know in that moment, because what happens is that's a godly vibration, and we can't sustain it. And so it happens like a flash, or we weave in and out of it like a hazy daydream, right? And it feels hard to take that wisdom with us, because the grief, which is this super dense energy that fills us up, it muddles that clarity. And so it's like right after someone dies, or right after um, you leave your city, or you end a relationship, and you're in that deep knowing, right, of what's important and which way you should go and what comes next. We need to anchor that wisdom. Um, this is when journaling or writing is important, or the practice of ritual becomes important, because it anchors us in our wisdom and our knowing in the physical world, so it doesn't get lost and float away once the grief seeps back in. So there is definitely wisdom to be had with grief, and there's definitely wisdom to be had with death. We have to be present with these moments. We can't bypass them. We can't run from them. We can't avoid them, which is what our culture teaches us to do, especially here in the West, when there is this deep separation from death. Um, when the funeral industry was uh, industrialized in the late 1800s, we were separated from death. Death used to be in home. We used to care for our dying in the home. We used to care for our dead in the home. We used to have home funerals, and we used to bury our own dead. And now we don't do that. We outsource that practice, that ritual. And so we no longer have to stay present with the discomfort of death. It can be over there in that hospital, in that funeral home, in that cemetery, away from us. There's a separation between the living and the dead. And my work is centered around bringing back right relationship between the living and the dead, and the living and dying. Because in that separation, Stephen Jenkinson talks about this in his book Die Wise, which I'm I just love so much. And I'm trying to share as much of it with the world as possible. But he talks about that the root of our grief, our collective grief, and like the root of all of our problems really is this separation that he calls homelessness. And when we're separated from death, we are then separated from our dead. We're then separated from the land. We're then separated from our gods. We're then separated from our bodies, our physical bodies. And so there's this deep separation. And so then we go out into this world searching, looking for home in every one and in everything and everywhere. And we're so desperate for it that we'll do anything to feel at home, including conquer other people, including conquer their lands, including heinous and horrific violence. We'll do this to feel not separated, to feel at home. And so, if we can be present with death, if we can bring right relationship between the living and the dead and the living and dying back into our world, we can reconnect with our dead. We can then reconnect with the land, with our gods, and then with our physical vessels and feel at home in our bodies and in our spirits and stop searching for that externally. So we need to stay present with death. We need to bring it back into our worlds. We need to create rituals or recreate or reclaim rituals around dying and death. And those rituals, people think that those rituals are spiritual, but the spirit and the human is one. And so those rituals look like music, look like flowers, look like candles, look like food, look like community, look like connection and expression of emotion. They look like emoting, crying, wailing, keening. They look like touching, laying hands on your dying and your dead. They look like wrapping them in sacred cloth. They look like placing them in the dirt, returning them back to the land through prayer and invocation and deep reverence for both the body and the land. Um, they look like remembrance. These rituals look like remembrance, uh, remembering people after they're gone, continuing to invoke their name and their spirit in your life and in your world. And these are some of the many ways in which we can create ritual with death and grief so that we stay present with death and grief so that we're no longer separated from death and grief.
You have put words into things that I have known. I always perceived that there was something more. In me being so interested about grief and death, I have always wanted to know why is it this way? And I have never thought that it was so deep. You put words into something that I knew was in there, but up until now, I can
And
comprehend.
it's even deeper because when we have systems that systematically separate people from their dead in their land and their gods and their bodies, then you can be in control of them. And and you know where their wound is because you created it. And so you know how to trigger it and you know how to make it ache deeper and you know how to uh, widen the wound, you know? And so it's deeper than even us just being wounded and being deeply grieved, deeply grieving. It's that our grief, our wound is being used as this weapon against us to keep us separated from one another, whether that be through class or race or socioeconomic status or um, borders that separate lands. Um, this wound is used to remove us from our homes physically and energetically and spiritually, and then keep us wanderers in this world and keep us separate from one another. So it's not only important that we reconnect with death so that we can um, reclaim our home, our right home, right? Energetically and physically, but also so that we can, as a collective, no longer be separated from one another um, and bring healing to each other.
And I I had a conversation with someone else the other day. We were talking about birth and how, like, nothing about giving birth, well, not nothing, but most of the experience about giving birth at a hospital is so disconnected from the natural way. And something that she said that I love, she said, we have industrialized and kind of like make it a medical thing, the miracle of birth. So now it's no longer a miracle, it's more like a traumatic experience. um the level of a surgery, like life threatening situation. And
Mhm.
I do feel when I'm hearing you that we're doing the same with our grief.
Yes, it's actually
Yeah.
women have been the keepers of wisdom and the domains of life, death, food, and education or expansion or learning. And all four of these domains, for lack of better word, have been industrialized. And so we see in the industrialization of these four aspects, major aspects of our life and our world, we can see how systems capitalize on our detachment. They capitalize on our trauma. We can see it with birth, like you just said, and how traumatic it could be to birth in a hospital. Um, when birthing used to be done at home with midwives, and it used to be this sacred and holistic and guided by nature in women experience. And then so did food, the way we feed ourselves and our people and our communities. It used to be um, from the earth to the hands to the mouths. And now it goes so many different places before we experience it to eat it. And on all of these places, it further disconnection. More things are added to the food that further disconnect us from ourselves, right? And then we think about school and how school used to be, children used to learn in the home and they used to learn in groups. Maybe, families would get together and parents, women, mothers, aunts, grandmothers would share this work of educating and expanding our children. And then it got moved into, small one room schoolhouses in which it was still under the domain of the divine feminine. And then it became industrialized. And now it serves as a pipeline to prisons. And so we also see this with death. How I just spoke of death and dying used to be in the home up to like 150 years ago, late 1800s. And now it's this industrialized thing. And all of these things have been systematically and strategically, all of these domains have been systematically and strategically taken away from the divine, the wisdom of the divine feminine to keep us separated from ourselves to keep women separated from themselves, to keep women separated from their children. Because if you look at communities who are being harmed on a global scale, communities who are being harmed, you can see, you can connect the dots that who is harmed first is women and children through assault, through starvation, through just outright murder, through brutality. When you can control or wound the feminine or the mother archetype, it breaks apart the power that the family unit has, which then breaks apart the power that the community has. And so it leaves people isolated and separated. We think about how we used to say it takes a village to raise the child. And now we have mothers out here trying to be whole villages to their family. And we're drowning. We're drowning. And we're going, help us, please. And instead of help, we're going, wow, you're a super mom. And we're like, no, we don't want to be a super mom. We want help. And so we can see it in so many layers. There's so many layers of this in which separation is used as a tool to keep us controlled, to keep us subdued, to keep us not our authentic selves, to keep us not in our power, really. And so that's why we need to reconnect. And it's why you see movements, radical movements of free birthers, women who are birthing outside of the system. It's why you see this movement of homesteading and I'm going to grow my own food and farm to table. It's why you see this movement of homeschooling. I'm going to take my child out of the system and teach them in home with other like-minded families. It's why we see this movement in death work, in which it's slow, but it's here. We are moving back to indigenous practices of dying and death in home and in the family and being cared for and taken care of in the community.
Yeah, the system wants us disempowered.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and and I feel like our body and the intelligence of our body knows that it's not sustainable. Having a nation that is disempowered is killing the earth
Yeah.
and many species. And so in order to survive and to have a thriving world, we need to get back to our power. And so our body is telling us.
Yes. In so many ways, we're receiving so many messages and wisdom from our body, from nature, from the way that the world, the earth quite literally erupts. We see this happen all the time when there's chaos and mass harm taking place. We then see the world, the earth erupt. We see these unprecedented earthquakes. We see these unprecedented volcanoes. This is not a coincidence at all because we are not separate from the earth. We are connected to the earth and we're not separate from one another. So I'm not separate from the pain or the chaos that's happening on the other side of the world. If I can feel it. I don't even need to tune into my body. Some people may need to tune into their bodies to feel it, but most of us can just outright feel it. And the earth can feel it because we're all connected and we're meant to be connected. In nations or empires that seek to separate us, it's not sustainable. It will implode. And it's why we see these empires on a timeline. We see them fall, around the same time. Continuously happens. And I this morning woke up wondering, frustrated. I mean, how many times do we need to see history repeat itself before we make another choice, before we listen to history itself? There's so many messages, there's so much wisdom being delivered in this moment, in the now. And it's begging for us to heed, heed it.
And there's also so much beauty in the future that we haven't given ourselves the chance to experience, the earth to experience. And so it's a great wake up call and a great invitation from the planet to seek for a future that we cannot even imagine, where every single human, every single sentient being is thriving. How, Kenya, what are some steps that we can take to start reclaiming and integrating the traditions and the wisdom that indigenous people had in the past in
Sure.
regards to grief and death that we have lost?
Yeah. I think you can start in a couple different places. You can start with the land that you're on, and you could start to do some research and do some homework about the land that you're on and the practices. Because there's no coincidence that we are on the land that we are on. There's a connection between you and the land that you're currently on and always on. If you have a call to travel to Italy, to Africa, to Japan, wherever it is, wherever the land is calling you, wherever you feel like you have a, I got to go, that's the land calling you. And there's a connection between you and the land. And so we can start by honoring that call and honoring that connection to the land and doing some research and some homework around um, the practices of the indigenous people to the land that we're on, and seeing how they resonate and how they feel in the body and how we can honor them in our current and present moments and experiences with death. Um, I shared this when I shared my mock funeral that I did for my death work, my apprenticeship, and we had to do for our final rites of initiation. We had to hold a mock funeral, if you will, and kind of move through it. And I incorporated some of the practices of the indigenous people here. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. Um, and I included, uh, for example, the Cherokee, after someone would die, they would clear the space with smoke and fire. And so I incorporated that into the home funeral that I was hosting. Um, they believe that it takes a certain amount of time for the soul to leave the body. And so I was honoring that in moments of silence. Um, the Choctaw face their dying or their dead a certain way, um, because that's the way in which they need to go in the afterlife. And so you could establish an altar that faces that direction. There are many ways in which we can connect with the indigenous um, practices of the people of the lands that we are occupying, and bring them into our world to honor them, um, to venerate the natives of our land, the indigenous people to our land. So that's one way that we can reconnect with this ancestral, this indigenous wisdom that death is inviting us to reconnect with. Um, Another way that we can reconnect is through presence, just really being present. And all of those things that I mentioned before, that when people are looking for these really deep spiritual practices, how can I how can I do this through a we're looking for like, you know, stereotypical ways of ritual, like there's candles everywhere and there's someone saying an invocation, and it doesn't have to be that way. We can set up altars that are filled with memories of our dead. You know, you could set up an ofrenda, like an altar of all of your dead, you know, and you could let it keep growing. The altar could be for a brief amount of time to observe after a person has passed, or it could be an altar that stays and it's a living altar. And, all of your dead go onto it and you feed it through love and putting flowers on it and, making it beautiful and making sure it's clean. That's how you feed it. You could talk to it, you could play music to it. So there's ways you can establish altars um, that are in the moment or that, are ongoing. We can commune with food, share food, we can share stories, we can play music, we can celebrate the life. Um, we can celebrate the physical body that they had. There's many ways to celebrate, even in death. And I think that's important as an important part of grieving as well is to celebrate what was, to honor what was. A lot of times in Western culture, we have a wake or a funeral and it's one day and we go and everyone is sad for that 3 or 4 hours and then we go back to like our regular lives and we rarely speak of the dead anymore or even of that moment and we just keep pushing forward to continue gathering in the name and the honor and the light and the spirit of our dead is another way that we can you know um, honor this grieving, uh, reconnect with death. We can, have Sunday dinners and continue to tell stories about them. We can we can reconnect with death and our ancestral wisdom through maintaining open communication with our dead, calling them in, praying to them, requesting to meet them in dream spaces, inviting them in your living space. Put their favorite flowers out, say their name, think of them. People sometimes are like, how do I communicate with the dead? And I'm like, oh, it's like a DM. You just think of them and boom, they're there. It's like it's a frequency that you just tap into and you can tap into that frequency just through wondering, just through thinking of them. And then they're there with you. And so if we think of them often, if we tell their stories, if we write their stories down and we share their stories, um, you know, uh, there's so many ways that seem mundane that are deeply there's a lot of deep wisdom in there. There's a lot of deep healing in there. They seem mundane, eating, communicating with one another, thinking of someone. These seem like mundane acts, but um, they're really sacred. They're really sacred acts when they're done with intention. And so I think, death and grief is inviting us into presence and is inviting us into meaningful and intentional ways of being alive and being with our dead.
Absolutely. And I feel like children should be used to having these conversations, and hearing about us, talking about our altars and our connection with the spiritual realm, with the land, with our ancestors. However, that is not what's happening in your experience. How do we talk to children about that? How is the grieving process for a child? How do we connect
Yeah.
these two worlds?
Yeah. I think we connect them by not hiding them because when we hide them, there's shame and fear built into that experience. So when you have a child and someone dies and you keep them from that death, you keep them from knowing that the person died, you keep them from the rituals, whether it be the funeral or the wake or gatherings, you keep them away from death. Uh, then at some point they're exposed to it and it's a shock to the system. And then also there's this fear around things that are hidden from children. And so they will have this growing fear about death, about others dying and themselves dying and what happens. And so if you think about it, when we had the we had our dying and our dead in our homes, children saw them. They saw grandma dying in her room, and they saw the process of which her body slowly died. And in their minds and in their own way of knowing, they understood that there was a process and it took time. And she may have got sick first and then sleepy next, and then she was gone. And there's these ways, very simple ways in which they understand things. And so it's not that kids can't understand them. We just need to present them in a way that they can digest it, that they can understand it. And so we don't want to keep it from them. And so kids would see grandma dying. And then when she died and her body was brought out and it was, shrouded and set out for visitors. They saw people come and cry on her and pray to her and call her name and share stories. And so they understood that this is what happens when someone dies. There is a sadness in the room. There is a sadness in the body, and it's okay. And how we experience this sadness is through the crying, is through having meals with one another, is through telling stories. They learned the medicine by watching, and they weren't afraid of the dead body that was in the living room. They played around it, and they may have stopped and talked to her, and they themselves had their own medicine in their own way of meeting death because they weren't kept from it. And so, and then they weren't confused about what happened to grandma when the body is gone, because they would have went with the family to the burial place. And perhaps she was even buried on their own land or somewhere nearby, or a family plot where everyone is buried together and people frequent and they visit. And so children were never kept from death. This fear around death, uh, it's a created thing. And it's created from the separation. And so we can introduce children to death by recreating those practices, by having children around when people are dying and acting as our normal selves and explaining to them the same way. I feel like if a parent can teach a child to read English, the most ridiculous language, if you can find ways to tell your child that there are 10 different ways to spell the word there, you can find a way to tell your child that someone was once here and then now their physical body is not here. We can find ways. There are great resources and books out there. We have this book that we used when our first family pet passed, while my daughter was, she was like 3, I think. And our family dog passed, and we read this book to her, and it was very straightforward. It was like, everything that lives dies when it can no longer live. And it wasn't this very like drawn out thing. And so when we had another family pet die, she understood that it was going to be sad for a moment in time, and it was going to be confusing for a moment in time. And that since our dog was a living thing, he was also a dying thing. And he died because he could not live anymore. And she just understood it in those very simple terms. And we offered ways for her to grieve. We drew pictures. We told stories the same way that we do with adults. We told stories. We let her feed him food before he passed. We sat outside with him. In the same ways that we do with adults, we offer these rituals, these seemingly mundane tasks, these opportunities for kids to participate. We invite them into the moment. We invite them to be present with death. We invite them to be present with dying. And we find simple words and simple phrases and simple ways that explain what's happening here. And knowing that it's okay if you say something quote unquote wrong. We can always explain ourselves later or explain ourselves further later, you know. Um, my husband and I were just having this conversation in the car, and he whispered something about death. And I was like, don't whisper, it makes it scary. And he was like, yeah, you're right. And I was like, just say it as it is. And she'll understand as much as she can. And what she can't understand, we'll help her with. And what we can't find the words for, we'll find another way. You know, you just keep showing up. You just keep remaining present with the difficulty, with the discomfort. And that's really what it is. It's death brings about a discomfort, you know, in the room and in the body and in the mind and in the heart. It's hard. It's a dense energy. It takes a long time to move through the body. And that's why we experience it in waves, right? Um, and so, of course, it brings about this discomfort, and we want to avoid the discomfort. And so we don't talk to our kids about it. We think they'll learn when they're older, they'll understand it. But when they're older, they're now afraid. So now you have the death, the discomfort of the death itself, and then the fear. So,
And as you're saying, um what was happening with your daughter, I do feel like children should be so connected to nature that it just becomes a natural thing to observe and to get used to. Yeah, just to observe the cycle of life and death,
mhm,
because everything in nature has this cycle. And the more you get used to experiencing, observing it, and getting used to it, the more able you are to process it, because you're constantly in that, you're in touch with it,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Explaining, like you're saying, it can start with nature. The talk about death, the invitation to be present with death, can start with nature, and it can start with spring. Look, everything's blooming. This is how flowers come alive. Trees are born, grass and birds, animals themselves, new babies are born in the spring. And then we can see that as the cycle moves in fall, look, things start to become brown, and the earth gets tired and she doesn't produce as much anymore. And a lot of things die, or a lot of things go into hibernation. And then, but know that life comes back. When? In the spring. And when we start to have these conversations with our children, and a lot of adults need this conversation as well, we can understand that energy doesn't die, it just transforms. And so the things that we lose, the loss that we experience, it comes back to us, and not in the same manifestation, right? If we lose someone, that person doesn't come back to us, but the love comes back to us. The joy comes back to us. The adventure comes back to us. All of these things return to us because it is a cycle. And the more we expose our children to this, and the more we're honest with ourselves about it, the better off we will all be, the less separated we will all be.
There was a beautiful example that you shared a few months ago, maybe, about your daughter grieving a friend who moved perhaps to another city, because grief is so expensive, right? It's not only about death. But as you were speaking, I thought about me grieving um the community that I left when I left religion, and not having, like the friendship and the community in general. And I had to go through the process of telling myself, well, what does community mean to me, and how can I imagine it in a different way? What do I want from it? And then the wisdom started coming, and like you said, it didn't take that long, and community came back in a way that I have never experienced it, with a level of wisdom and intimacy that I have never experienced. But I had to do the work first, and I had to ask myself, what do you want from it? And so that was my gift of grieving something, letting it go, and then getting it back again in a different, holier way.
Yeah. When we think about the cycle of life and death, and when we think of it in the simplest terms, that like everything that lives will die, we also have to understand that um, when something dies, it's because it could no longer live. And we are so afraid of death that we have become in this kind of relationship with the living that we hold on to it so tightly until it becomes um, poison instead of medicine. If we think about relationships, um, uh, I often share this in readings. I'm like, there's a relationship here and it's dying. It's actually been dead, and you're the one who's keeping it alive. You're the one who's keeping it on life support. Okay. It wouldn't be here if you would just let it go, if you would just let it die. And in the dying, something new will be born, because that is what we know about the life and death cycle. And so there's something to be said about our relationship with death, that we're so fearful of it that we can't let go of the living, even long past things have, you know, lived. They're expired. Yes, they're no longer living, whether it be relationships or work or places or spaces that we're occupying that no longer serve us in the way that they once did. And we hold on to them because we're so afraid of what life looks like without that person, without that job or that work, without living or being in this city or being in this space or being in this community, right? We're so afraid of death that we forget that life comes next. We forget what comes next in the sequence of this experience, right? And that a lot of times us keeping things alive, us keeping things on life support, is them existing at the very minimal of their vibration. And so it doesn't serve us. And it at some point becomes poison instead of medicine. And it then becomes a disservice to our life and our journey. And so there's also something to be said about that too, the way that we hold on to things that are dying or things that are even no longer living. And I think about like with my daughter and her friend, she moved to Costa Rica. And so she's so far away from us. And then she had another friend who moved to a new school like almost 2 weeks later. So she experienced this death of friendship back to back. And so even in school, if is school is another great way to introduce death to your children. And you can simply introduce it by almost everything has an ending point. Think about kindergarten. It ends. And when it ends, we're so excited for what comes next. And that's the birth of first grade, or the birth of first grade coming after kindergarten. But also what happens is that you'll never have the same group of classmates ever again. Some people will move, people will go to different classes. It'll never be this group again. And we can explain to them that friends come and go, and that we move spaces, whether it be classrooms, or schools. And this is also a way in which we experience death and birth, and that it happens in every aspect of our life. And, if you don't want to use death and birth, if you're not there yet, I talked to my daughter about change. I told her that every time we experience change or something new and exciting, it will always come with something sad, some type of loss. And I said, and this is what we call bittersweet. And this is the moment where something is born and we're rejoicing in its birth, and we're also in mourning of whatever it is that we lost. And those two things, it's not that they can exist in the same breath, it's that they do, and it's that they must. We must let them exist in the same breath. Because when we shun one and only focus on the other, we're losing a whole piece of ourselves in the process. And so they must exist in the same breath, the rejoicing and the mourning, the birth and the death, the celebration and the grieving has to exist in the same moment. And you can pass it off. You can brand it as bittersweet, as I did too with my daughter, which is true. It is bittersweet. Um, but there are ways to explain this to children. And in a lot of ways, adults need to understand it as well.
We do. My last question for you, Kenya. Now that we're speaking about community, friendship, groups of people, what role does community play in the grieving process? And how can we foster this sense of community in our modern world?
Yeah, it plays a sacred and integral and necessary role in the grieving process. And honestly, we don't grieve well as a collective. And so I think we can start by showing up for one another. And we can do this by asking people how they are, and then more than once, because we're conditioned to say, I'm fine and everything's okay. So we need to show up for people, be present with the loss, then show up for people again and again and again. And we need to find different ways to show up for them. We can show up for them physically by being present, at funerals, at wakes, in the days and the weeks that come after by stopping by, and just checking on them, just being physically present. We can show up for them spiritually through prayer, through uplifting them. We can show up for them by asking them what they need. Sometimes people, I feel like there's a lot of confusion around what help is. Some people think that they're helpful by doing what they know or what it is that they would like done in that moment. And they fail to receive information about what is really needed in that moment from the person who is grieving or the person who is in need, right? Of care, of community care. And so we can ask them what they need. Um, is it food that you need? Is it childcare services that you need? Is it resources that you need? Is it transportation? Is it just someone? Is it companionship? We can kind of give them a bunch of different options because sometimes thinking can be hard in the grieving process, and let them choose. But we want their input. We want their input because things are not helpful if the other person doesn't experience them as helpful. I hope I'm saying that in a way that's understandable and comprehensible. But so showing up for people in a present way, in a spiritual way, and then showing up for them in the long run. Because grief, we talked about it, is this intense feeling, it's this dense energy. And so it takes a really long time to leave the body. And since it's so dense, it can't happen all at once. It would overwhelm the system. And so our wise bodies know that we need to release a little bit here and release a little bit here. And so it's why, 3 weeks after someone passes, we may have this very visceral and physical experience, and then maybe nothing for another 4 weeks. And then a month later, 2 months later, we have a very physical reaction again, or a very emotional reaction. And that's because our body knows what we can handle and when and how to release it. So as a community, we need to be there for those releases that happen long after the loss has taken place. Show up for people days after, show up for people weeks after, show up for people months and years after. And I think also not being afraid to bring death into the room. I think people are afraid, like, to say the dying person or the dead person's name because they're afraid to bring death into the room. I assure you, there is no room in which the grieving enter, in which the dead are not present in their mind or in their heart or energetically. And so we can't separate ourselves from it. So let's not try. We can ask people, how are you feeling about the loss or the death of your mother? How are you, how are you coping? Are there ways in which I could support you? Um, Bringing the dead into the living realm. Remember that story? Remember that time? Your mom, start telling stories about them, um, ask them how they're carrying the aching, the longing, the missing. What are they doing with that energy? Offer them ways to transmute it. Would you like to go for a walk? Would you like me to read to you? Would you like to hear a poem? Would you like to hear music? Would you like to write about it and have me read your words? Would you like to sit in silence? Offer them ways to process the many different ways in which grief manifests. Um, I think that at every turn, when we wonder, when we ask ourselves, what can we do here? The invitation is to be present. The invitation is to not run. The invitation is to not avoid or bypass. The invitation is to stand in the present moment um, with everything you got, and sometimes that's a lot and sometimes it's not. And that's okay. Showing up authentically for people is a way that the community plays a part in the grieving process. Um, and just allowing people themselves, the grieving, then to show up as however they need to present in that moment. There's so much restriction and limitation on grieving. It's like we get, this amount of days if an immediate family member died. We get a shorter amount of days if a, extended family member dies, in which you get those 3 days, you get those 4 days, whatever, to grieve and be down and sad. And then you have to show up again. Allowing people to show up however they can in the moment, allowing them to be their authentic selves, allowing them to grieve out loud um, without feeling like you yourself have to have the medicine. Just being present is the medicine. The work is on the grieving person to do. Our work as a community is to hold space for their work. So we don't have to heal them. We can't. We don't have to do the work for them. We just need to show up in ways that makes the work sustainable and possible for them.
So beautiful, so profound, so rich. Your conversation, this conversation, your wisdom. Thank you so much, Kenia. I, as we close today's conversation on grief and the journey through it, I really want to thank you for your wisdom, your experiences, because I know that it's not you're speaking from experience, and that must have been very deep. And I'm grateful that you decided to take the medicine and share with the community, with the world. That is so healing and is so valuable. And I also want to invite our listeners to take make space, take the time to understand grief at a more intimate level, to reclaim these practices, this wisdom that we already possess. It's in our bones, in our DNA, it's in the land, but we need to reconnect with it.
Do absolutely.
And also to be exactly the last invitation you gave us, to be present, to create spaces, safe spaces for people to grieve and just be present for them. I want to invite people also to share in the comments if there's any thoughts or any experiences that they would like to share with us. And I is there any last piece of advice that you would like to share with the audience today, Kenya?
I think that we're in a really pivotal moment in time, in history, in the world, um, in which we are shedding in a massive way to come home to ourselves more authentically. There is a death that's taking place um, collectively. Life as we knew it will no longer exist, and we're birthing a new way of life. And this is very scary. This can be very scary for a lot of people because it invokes the unknown. And when we have the unknown, people get fearful and they cling to the dying things. And so, my invitation would be to um, sit with your fear around dying for you personally and like your personal world, and then for what that means collectively. Invite that fear in and have a conversation with it and hear it out, and then know that you don't have to act in accordance, in compliance with the fear. You can make another choice. You can be afraid and still let go of the dying things. You can be afraid of the birth and still choose to be reborn. So my invitation is to not let the fear keep you in a place in which no longer exists.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm truly grateful. Thank you, every single person that will join, that will watch the replay, that will tune in. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for giving us hope. Thank you for your interest in healing and in providing support to others to find this common ground and to heal collectively. So thank you, Kenya. We look forward to having you again in this podcast. Until next time, take care of yourself.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tune in and transform with me. Until next time, keep your spirits high and your magic untamed.